Today, I'm excited to be joined by a true trailblazer and influential voice in the national security space, Alexis Lasselle Ross. Alexis is the president of Apex Defense Strategies, a firm dedicated to navigating the complex intersection of defense policy and cutting-edge technology. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Her career is a masterclass in dedicated public service and strategic leadership. Alexis served in a number of critical positions at the highest levels of the U.S. government. For example, she was the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Defense, providing counsel on the most pressing national security issues. She also served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Army for Strategy and Acquisition Reform, where she was at the forefront of efforts to modernize the Army's acquisition process and accelerate the adoption of new technologies, as well as the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. Alexis also served as a professional staff member on the House Committee on Armed Services and as a civil servant advising senior Army leadership in the Pentagon. So from the Pentagon and Capitol Hill, and now to the private and nonprofit sectors, Alexis has consistently been at the heart of the conversations that are shaping the future of our national defense. Her extensive experience provides a rare and valuable perspective on everything from strategic planning and acquisition reform to the integration of emerging technologies. And I'm thrilled to have her on the podcast and hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome, Alexis. We're glad to have you here and to talk about a number of topics as it relates to defense. Your experience is, as you were joking before, a little different than some of our previous guests, and I'm so glad to have a refreshing change of perspective because we're going to talk about other aspects of how defense and national security is changing. Maybe to start, I want to go into your background, let it be a form of introduction to the folks that have not seen you present before. And maybe we'll start with some of your earliest bit of work. Can you tell me, as a form of introduction, the most ridiculous thing you ever saw happen in Congress? Any standouts?
Too many to name. I mean, I can get to the scandalous or I can get to no. So I started on the Hill a long time ago. This is at this point, probably almost 25 years ago. It was a different place back then. Very different place. Most ridiculous things. Well,
let's go into that's an unfair question. It's mostly just to intimidate you at the outset, which is a terrible thing for a host to do. Okay, so you spent all these years in Congress, but can you tell us more what that means? So I think a lot of folks, even in uniform, may just assume, were you an elected official? Were you a staff member? What does Congress do as it relates to defense?
Okay, so the good question. I started on the Hill, first job out of college. I was a staff assistant. And I had a lot of different jobs on the Hill eventually before I left, but I was always working for the House Armed Services Committee. And so the committees in Congress, they spend a lot of time focusing on whatever is in their jurisdiction, whether that's healthcare or labor, or in this case, national security. They essentially work national policy. So they write the bills and provide oversight to the departments of jurisdiction. So in this case, the Pentagon. So my time was spent on the House Armed Services Committee 2 different times in my career. Had, started there, went away, came back at a later time. But yeah, so that is essentially what, in a nutshell, what Congress does in national security. I could get into this. You probably don't know this, but my PhD is in public policy, but my actual academic field is Congress and national security.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I know.
Well, this is great. Brilliant. And I love that you found an opportunity to please share more of those backgrounds, because as I was sharing before, while we at this in this community have great admiration for those that have public service in uniform, military service, an example, I admire your many years of public service in a different outfit, right? So you're serving national security, as you mentioned, from the policy and national security perspective. But let's go deeper into some of your experiences. You mentioned House Armed Services Committee. Can you tell more about that? What roles they have as you've seen it, and maybe some of the big disruptive changes over the years as you look back from the policy perspective? And I'd also love to get into, I think, another aspect of your leadership and work, which is on the appropriations and acquisition side of things, which is maybe more money, less policy. So I'd love to hear about your experiences on each side of those.
Yeah. So over the years, the Congress has been, involved in a variety of ways in national security. And after, I would say, maybe World War II, Congress started kind of getting a little bit less involved in some of the, a lot of people would say they abdicated a lot of control to the president for a lot of national security purposes. I think that's actually not very true. I think Congress remains very involved still in certain areas. I would call it maybe less about the use of force or employment of force, War Powers Act and stuff, but more about how the business end of defense, personnel matters. How much you're going to pay people, things like that. Acquisition. Yeah. How are you actually going to buy stuff? Military construction, facilities, installations. Where are things going? What do they look like? So Congress is really involved in a lot of ways. They generally get motivated by a few things, usually power, politics, and parochialism. Those are basically the 3 Ps. But so as a staffer, though, kind of what that looks like is, how you actually put that into effect, or what do you actually do? There's like a range of options that Congress uses. I mean, ranging from just oversight and like taking a look at what's going on and calling and asking questions, like staff calling and asking questions at the Pentagon, going out to see things and, different units or facilities. And then also holding hearings. So kind of walking down a range, the spectrum gets more and more intense as they get more involved. Walking down that line, that spectrum, you have hearings. And then before you actually even get to legislation, which is the actual direct action, and really how Congress shows its power. And they legislate 2 different things. They legislate either funding or policy. And so the authorization committees, they're very involved in the, how the government works, policies and procedures of what would happen. The appropriations committees, they're involved in actually giving the checks, the funding. So after I left Congress, I worked in the Pentagon for a while. Early on, my first job in the Pentagon was on the Army staff. And I worked with a lot of general officers. And because I had worked in Congress, they always asked me to talk about Congress or give briefings and like do word of board, like mock hearings and things like that. And one of the things that I figured out I had to explain a little bit, because a lot of people weren't hip to the details on, who has more power, authorizers or appropriators. We could debate this over and over again in many different ways. And I think the world is always changing and, status quo is changing. It used to be the appropriators were pretty powerful, but if you think about it, actually, the appropriations bill, how much money you can spend, is only good for 1 year. But when you put something into law, you think about some of the more consequential things or some of the little things that are still there today. You have to kind of work around all the time, every day, day in, day out. That stuff goes into the United States Code and it never leaves until somebody takes it out. So Congress takes it out. So it's like, it's like a diamond is forever, right?
At the risk of interrupting you, though, you're giving me a revelation that I'm struggling even to process. So your example of who decides how much the soldiers get paid, that is a congressional function. I'm having kind of a wake-up call because I'm thinking, wait, I'm a business leader. How much I pay my employees is a central business responsibility. The executive of that business just has how much to pay to people. Yeah. Normally, and I think from an institutional perspective, obviously the president of the United States is the executive branch that drives the military action, but that person is not deciding how much to pay the troops. Congress is. And as you start getting into how they are employed, you say budget's only for a year. Well, if you're a publicly traded company, you're reporting your financials every quarter, and then you report to that. So what I'm realizing now is, Alexis, you've actually been a business leader of defense. You've just, I don't think, ever been called that. And I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult. We're talking about foul language. How dare you call me a business leader? But like,
a business leader.
Oh, really?
Congressional. Well, I mean,
but the business of defense is what you're describing. It's how much to pay to people. What are we budgeting on short cycles? What are the main focus areas? Who's writing the policies? What are we buying? That's all business. That is a business function. How much money is spent on something is a form of power, right? And so that's the role of the business executive. I'm even going further.
But here's the kicker, though, is those decisions that Congress is making, they become like quasi-entitlements because they're written into law. And like I said, they're not changed unless Congress writes or revises the law. It becomes mandatory, essentially. It's like mandatory spending because like Social Security and stuff, because whatever you're putting into law for like a certain kind of benefit or a pay raise or some sort of bonus or whatever, you really politically unpalatable to take it away. So it keeps building on itself. And I'm not saying that we have, we always should make sure that everyone's compensated well for the kind of work that military service is. Obviously, it's extremely difficult and physically taxing and really difficult on the body. So, and it's difficult on the family. So obviously compensation is important, but it's an extraordinary amount of power that Congress holds because they alone are the ones developing that compensation package, and it becomes fixed. It's hard to change. You can't like change it every year like a business leader would based on, things like retention needs or mixing skill sets and stuff like that.
All right, so you're talking about headcount. So we're going to talk about Doge in a little bit. You can't ignore that, I think, historic example of disruption in the staffing of the federal government. But before we get there, I want to give it some context. So in looking at the business history of the Department of Defense, how much have things changed in your experience over the years? I'll give it a historical anchor for a moment. I'm thinking about like the Truman hearings where he was, we have a senator that before president yelling at congressman, yelling at the war profiteers, right? And trying to change, how things are being priced and then deployed, right? Obviously, major wars and major conflict changed the business of acquisitions and how many, whatever planes are in the sky over Afghanistan. But you've actually been at the table. You've been in the room when these business decisions have been made for major investments over a number of years. Can you, as you look back over your experience, what are the major disruptions that you recall from how the business of defense has changed?
So major disruptions, I'm going to go farther back than what I remember. I'm going to go farther back to a little bit more you kind of have to, right? Because if you think about, I think in the 80s, it is an important, I just want to make sure that our scale goes far back enough.
That's what I'm asking.
How the 80s.
Yes, he's not my question because I want to figure out how crazy is Doge right now, or is it really not that different from previous years? That's basically what I'm getting at.
So don't let me forget to come back to that, because I think a lot of it, I don't think it's wild and out of the realm of what it is to what is justified. I think that it is. I think what is surprising people is the tactics and the methods. I just think that's in the speed. So I think it's not what people are used to, but I wouldn't say that there hasn't been change like this. It's just coming in a different sort of fashion and a different rate. So it feels probably very dramatic. So, I mean, if we're talking about the historical trend, like where do we see inflection points? I think one that I would want to include that's a big one is the 80s. I mean, there was a time where Congress was getting pretty frustrated with the Pentagon over some strong, actually also the 60s. And you have to think about the budgeting changes that that McNamara brought in to try to professionalize and create a different kind of institutional process for an organization for the way that we budget things. And that was needed at that time. And in the 80s, we had a lot of concern over the lack of interoperability of the equipment and what we were buying. And in military operations, it demonstrated that we weren't working together. The different services weren't working together very well. You also had a lot of severe costs. Well, it became very popular. A lot of news about, the $300 hammer, or $300 toilet seat, the $500 hammer, whatever it was. I wasn't around in the 80s. But you remember all these things, and we still remember today, all of these complaints about how expensive everything was. And so there was a dramatic change and acquisition of time too. And then in the 90s, there was a huge change for trying to buy commercial. The original Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, I think, FACL. This is like early 90s. So acquisition and how we buy things and what we pay for it and how Congress gets involved to try to, change the process by which we buy things it happens pretty routinely. And it has historically been happening for a while. So we're just now in this, I would say there's a new era of acquisition reform. I mean, it's kind of a DC popular thing to do. We come back to it every so often. The phase we're in right now probably started around 2015, 2016. And it's been amping up slowly, like amping up and up and up. There's, people like myself have been working on it, and I'm happy to see that there's now more people working on it. In other words, I feel like when myself and others started this a few years ago, there were some people in Congress pushing for it. I was in Congress at the time. I was on the House side at the time. The House and the Senate were pushing for it. It's like the McCain era. But now it feels different. It feels like there's a dramatic uptick and a bigger demand signal from industry for things to change, a bigger threat signal. I think we all agree that the threat of China and how China is evolving with its military capabilities and its ability to incorporate tech. And I think we're all of both parties, all branches of government, industry, government alike. I think we're all seeing the same thing. So there's alignment. So I think finally, after a few years, I think there's an opportunity for some even bigger change. And I think the leadership right now at this time is going to use that opportunity to make change. And so I think that's what we're seeing.
And is that big change a change in policy, a change in how the money is spent, or the people that are making those business decisions?
I think all. all of
Oh,
that.
which
Yeah.
one's the strongest? Which one's the weakest? It's and what I will confess a personal opinion. Maybe I'll share the personal opinion, not my company's opinion, not our nation's opinion, just my personal opinion, which is of course like the old elephant game, influenced by the part of the system I'm touching. And so I'm going to probably have a pretty a critical view, and I'd love for you to tell me that I'm an idiot and that I'm completely wrong about the perspective I'm about to share. I think that because I work in software and because I'm a machine learning person, I'm an engineer, I'm in all this kind of a different level of overheated markets. If defense acquisitions become more popular, maybe overly discussed, AI is getting overly discussed. If anything, there's AI fatigue in my experience, but I still work in that space. Okay. And what I've seen in the business of AI for the government, the people that are buying AI are not the builders or practitioners of AI. That has not been my experience since, say, and I'm actually wearing my federal former employer shirt when I was at the Department of Commerce. I was a chance to participate in some acquisitions a few years back. The weather people know more about weather than the people selling weather data. Like the buyers know more than the sellers. I was with the National Weather Service. That's an extraordinary institution. The practitioners know how to call BS on something if someone's selling snake oil. In the AI world, I don't see a lot of BS being called because I don't think the buyers know more than the sellers. Not that they're not trying or well-intentioned. They're just not the people from the folks that built it. And so they don't know how to yell like Truman did at, why are you charging $500 for a hammer? If you've never seen a hammer before, you don't know how much it should cost, right? Steel, where's that come from? Right? So that's my narrow view. And I think, now, not that warfare is only AI. I recognize that is a very small sliver. But I'm wondering how much of that problem as a business problem, the business of government, which I'm learning is really the effect and influence of the Hill and Congress, where you've had many years of experience. How do you solve that business problem if the ones spending the money that have been either policy set or appropriated don't know the best way to spend it because they are well-intentioned but have no clue how to discern one proposal from another? Did you see my question? So over to you.
Yeah.
I don't know how widespread that is, though.
Okay. I don't think it's a single anecdote. It is a widespread, it's a trend. And it's all, the system that we have today is a complete result of reactionary decisions at some point in the past. You could draw a line. I mean, you could collect all these different little data points of this happened, and now it pops out that we have now. And what we have now is a system where, the acquisition of workforce is not exactly, or actually anyone in government is not extremely adept at technical matters. As the weapon systems become more technologically advanced, that gap is going to get bigger and bigger. These are not the systems that we had in the 60s and the 80s. This is now very high-tech stuff. So I remember being on the Hill years and years ago when there was an interest in just reducing the size of the workforce, the acquisition workforce. They called it the choppers. It was like, everything's got, we got to cut down the number of choppers, the people that just buy the stuff, right? I don't think it's not exactly a very nuanced view of understanding what that workforce does. And so now, and it's just one of the many things that probably contributed to a situation we have today where there's not a lot of people that have a lot of expertise, but a lot of other reasons why this comes to be too. So as the more technical know-how either leaves the government or is never really there, like industry pulls away from the level of knowledge that the government has, it just gets harder. So what do you do? So what we've augmented with in government acquisition workforce is a lot of systems engineering and technical advisory contracts, CETA contracts. So there's contractors that sort of embed inside program offices and help them understand what they're looking at, help them evaluate or understand with the more technical aspects of things. But then there's consequences to that too, though. There's a lot of people that would argue that the CETA contractors have the incentives for them to make the process harder, longer, because that's more work for them, more
because it's billable hours, right? Yeah, say that. Yeah, the old, like a house construction. If I'm doing a bathroom repair on billable hours, guess what? They're going to find more work to do because that's what they get paid, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's every time the problem with policy Nothing's very cut and dry. Every time you make an adjustment in one area, you end up squeezing the balloon, and it creates these consequences, unintended or otherwise, in like multiple different areas. And so now, for a variety of reasons, we have less technical workforce. And yes, you're right. They probably don't understand AI. They don't probably know what they're looking for. There should be somebody that helps them understand and manage that buying process. But funny enough, the government is just reduced in number. A lot of memos have gone out from the Department of Defense directing to reduce the number of support contracts. So one way or another, all of this stuff is going to just keep shifting and moving around again.
I want to talk more about these shoppers, because I feel like I want to better understand. It feels like it's a symptom of a larger disconnect. It sounds like that you're working with and know quite well. But I also feel like that's the pointy end of where a consequence happens. Like in the private sector, supply and demand. If I'm charging more for lemonade, in theory, I should have less shoppers, because the pricing goes up. I should have less consumer interest in such things. There's a rationality between supply and demand in terms of the reflections of pricing. I feel like that's the point of sale, right? In the classic industrial examples. What is the point of sale for national security? I think it's the shoppers. And I want to better understand that community, at least in terms of how it implements the policies and appropriations worlds that I think you've worked so hard on. Like you can write this big program, you can create this new shift, and whatever it may be, replicator, the shift turns into a pay whatever it may be. And then, but ultimately, if money does not move in that direction, then the policy could be perhaps not affected as desired. So I'm going to throw some stereotypes about these shoppers, and I'd love to have you say, way off on that one, or like maybe that's some truth in that. I think they're normally called contracting officers or chartered support staff for such things. I think there's like 3,000 of them in America, and I think they're overworked and underpaid, trained to mitigate risk, and not celebrated by senior officials as being the most important person in implementing a program. How wrong is that?
I don't know the number, especially. Okay. I mean, if you take a look at Army, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, there's probably a lot.
Okay.
So there's two different kinds of acquisition officers. There's the program managers and the contracting officers. You kind of, when you come in, you kind of have two different tracks, right? You go one way or the other. Program management is obviously a really critical aspect of acquisition, because you're developing the strategy by which you're going to buy something. So you're going to determine kind of a little bit more about understanding, are you buying something commercial off the shelf? Are you developing something unique? And you work with a contracting officer to essentially take it that last sort of tactical mile to go out to industry and get it and bring it onto contract, right? And so evaluate the offers and all that. So both tracks, both communities have, an important role in all this. Yes, one of the biggest sort of tension points or challenges is that the system, the community, has for so long been risk averse based on the requirements of the job. And remember how I said a minute ago that so often the system we have today is based on reactions from past experiences. Something happened, somebody did a knee-jerk reaction, and it creates a new, has an outcome. It reverberates for years. This is exactly what happened. So every time there's some there's some mess up in the system, somebody buys a, whatever, $6,000 hammer or whatever, Congress reacts. It's extremely reactionary. Congress loves to get involved. There is, if you look at Title 10 United States Code, which is the code that is responsible for or dictates all the statute and the law for the military, the sections on procurement, it's like a graveyard of past mistakes. It's barnacles. It just keeps adding and adding and adding, and no one wants to take anything away. It was actually, so there was a time when we were going to try to take some things away. And sidebar here, we were trying to take some things away. It was on Congress at the time. It was a staff member, the chairman of the HASC, that was House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry, great gentleman from Texas, he called it skinny the code. Like, let's try to take everything out. Where are the problems? Try to take it out. So we in the House side tried to take a whole bunch out. And we went through this laborious task of looking through everything. Okay, how old is this? Like, why was this in here? Brought it over to the Senate, because you House, Senate, you have two different versions of the defense bill. You come together at the end to conference it, to make reconcile all the differences, and make one bill to go to the president to sign. Guess how much stuff we actually got rid of?
Some of the most important things?
I just didn't feel like, looking back on it, didn't feel like much. And so everything that was there was put in for some reason. And that member of Congress that drove it in the first time is still there, member of Congress, senator, whatever. And so it's just hard to convince anybody to take anything away. All right, that was my sidebar. Back to the thing, back to what I was talking about. The culture very much reflects the system in which it operates. And that system is underpinned by all this statute and regulation. And so we've got an overly regulated system, and it creates an extreme risk aversion. And so how do you combat that? You either take away the regulation, take away the underbrush, or you have leaders that push and reward the individuals to operate differently. And so that leadership has to basically encourage creativity, but more importantly, back them up when something goes wrong, back up the contracting officer, the program manager when something goes wrong. Ideally, you have both things. You take away the underbrush and you have leadership encouraging everyone to operate differently. But the one flaw in all that is Congress doesn't usually, like I said, Congress doesn't usually take a lot away, rules, regulations, and leadership changes too fast. So, these programs, they do take a long time to field. And when they take, a few years, say you're developing something like, a ship, an aircraft, tank, and it takes several years to actually field, the leadership will have changed 2, 3, 4 times. So whoever let you sign up for something, like a certain kind of risky contract or take a fly on an unknown, untested vendor, and if something goes wrong, you're left holding the bag and the leader's gone. So it's kind of I'm not trying to explain it away or excuse it. I'm just saying that's kind of helping, hopefully, articulate from what is actually happening on the inside.
I appreciate you sharing that, and it's bringing up a question that's very loaded in its terminology, but I'll just ask it, and then we can maybe dig deeper into what the terms actually mean. Given the dynamic you just described, can there ever be a program of record for something innovative?
I think so.
Because it seems like a contradiction, right? You're going to programmatic fielding. Innovative means new, which is intrinsically disruptive and risky, right? So it seemed to be a contradiction in terms, right?
Actually, technically speaking, a program of record really just means something's been budgeted. It's a funding line, and it's there, and you have a consistent level of funding for it. Shouldn't we have consistent funding for innovation? But you need the flexibility to take that funding and spend it on what you want to spend it on. So I would argue, yes, you can have a program of record that is a very innovative technology if you have flexibility in funding and you're not locked into these very discrete and very specific funding lines, which is to some extent self-imposed by the military departments. The way that they build their budgets, they're just a little bit too detailed. Nobody ever said it had to be that way, right? But that's the way it is. So I think we're actually hopefully making some progress finally on reevaluating and sort of pushing for better budgeting and more flexible funding in acquisitions right now. Side story. So I was doing acquisition reform on the Hill. We talked about that sort of at this wave that we're in right now of acquisition. It started at the time that I was on the Hill, and then I went over to the Army and I was doing acquisition in the Army. And there were a lot of things that we were doing to try to change the acquisition. I should stop and say that acquisition is actually 3 subsystems. There's funding, requirements, and then the kind of pure acquisition of just like program management and contracting, what I was saying before, how you actually buy stuff, procurement. So I was working acquisition reform, trying to change how we were organized for the process, basically utilize a lot of the authorities that Congress had just started to give us to move faster and to get more innovation. And one of the things that became very clear early on was that we have a problem with funding. And this is kind of before, it was definitely before it got popular. I would say we're at a popular state where people questioning funding. There was a commission on it. A commission, I think they wrapped up maybe 6-9 months ago or something like that on how to change funding. But it became really clear that we can go as fast as we want to go, but we're going to be held up by funding. Because when you're the way that our budgeting process works is you're putting in an estimate or you're programming funds a couple years in advance. And then so it's about 2 years in advance that you're developing a budget before it goes to Congress, because it has to go through, it starts in the military department, but it has to go up at the Secretary of Defense's level for review, and then the Office of Management and Budget for review, and then over to Congress. And their process is so long, especially when you consider that they don't finish the budget on time at the beginning of the fiscal year like they're supposed to. They often roll into a continuing resolution, and you end up basically stuck at last year's funding level for many, many months. This time is the first year we had a full year continuing resolution. And so that doesn't allow for new start. Well, this one did, but it often doesn't allow for new starts. So you get kind of frozen in time. You're frozen in amber a little bit. So that's an extra year. And so by the time that actually the Congress writes the check and it goes back to the executive branch to apportion and dish out more months still. So it's basically it's essentially like having an idea and getting the money 5 years later. So it's so disconnected from the technology cycle that I think is one of the biggest issues with speed and lack of speed. And so we were trying to. So a few years ago, my staff did this little we try to get this. We hunted for all possible authorities we could find to make things go faster. Found a couple of good ones from years and years ago that nobody knew were in there. We found a lot of shit buried in Title 10. And so we found some stuff, had this great even multiplier effect when we put them all together, these different funds that allowed for flexibility and stuff. Briefed it up to the secretary, wanting to get this, this is the new wave of acquisition reform. But at the time, we couldn't really get it off the ground. It was that at the time, there were not enough people talking openly about how funding is one of the big problems in acquisition and about that inflexibility and lag in the funding cycle. And who really controls a lot of the funding? Well, the OMB and predominantly Congress and the appropriations committees. Appropriations committees have a lot of power in funding your programs and controlling your budget. And so at the time, there was still, it would have really been very disruptive to how they controlled and exercised that power. So, we didn't.
All right, just to make sure, interrupting you, I'm making sure I'm understanding the story that you found novel vehicles to enable something to move faster, better, cheaper, but the very existence of such capability was offensive to people that didn't want that to be known. Am I saying that right?
I'm saying that there was, the anticipated criticism from the appropriations committees was problematic. But I think we're in a different place now. I think in the last few years, I think it's really hard for the appropriations committees I think that everyone recognizes there's an issue. And I think that they're starting to understand that. And I think there's more opportunity now for change in the way we do, flexibility in funding. And so I think the circumstances are ripe for that kind of change. I think we're going to start seeing that kind of change. So I'm glad that everybody's coalesced on these ideas and there's more people interested in actually significantly changing how we do acquisition. Because for those of us that have been doing this for, a little while, it's like, great, come on in, the water's warm, and let's actually turn some shit up and do it, So I think we're getting there.
I admire the vigor and I have a lot of empathy for what you're describing because, so I'm an entrepreneur and as often is criticized, it's not the product, it's the timing. I invented MySpace, but it needed to wait a few years for Facebook to take it over, right? It's not, it doesn't necessarily, it is an unfair truth of the market dynamics that if you have a great idea or product or innovation, policy innovation, programming innovation, technological innovation, if the market's not ready to receive it, it can be very frustrating for those that have been fighting, pushing that boulder uphill for so many years. And so I empathize. What I'm hearing is a description of you fighting the good fight with a breakthrough set of innovations, revelations, so that our national security can be strengthened. And while there wasn't necessarily receptivity in certain audiences at times for that moment at that time, that now it's more open, it sounds like, in your experience and what you've seen, that this is an opportunistic time, disruptive and, however chaotic it may be, that there is levels of which recognizing that the business of defense can be improved. Am I saying that right? Am I reflecting the fact? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're finally getting to a place where change it's happening. And I think that in the next couple of years, I think we're going to see a lot of it. Like I said, there's three major buckets that stand to be, affected here: requirements, funding and acquisition. And so all within the big umbrella of the defense acquisition system. And I think that when you look at all three of those, there's been a lot of nibbling around the margins, incremental change, sort of adjustments throughout the years in the procurement system, how we actually buy stuff. Because again, that's where Congress loves to exercise its oversight. So they've been at it for a while, but it's gotten a little bit faster, a little bit smoother, but there's also other areas that are a little bit less plowed ground that have great opportunity, requirements and funding. And so requirements have been, it's not an area actually that Congress gets involved in. It's a military, it's usually on the uniform side, and it's governed by internal DoD process. So they could fix it themselves. They don't, and Lord, we don't need Congress getting involved in, any more in requirements or anything like that. But Congress is starting to get kind of interested, actually. So we'll see, they might start dabbling in requirements. So I guess my advice is get it together, get your house in order before Congress comes a knocking. So, but that's one area where I think there's starting to get to be some improvements and some streamlining. And I think, they can continue to institutionalize that because everybody does it slightly differently. Army, Navy, all of that. So the more that we get some strong change and it's pervasive throughout the department in that area, I think the better we'll get. And then I think, but the last frontier is funding. And I think funding, but the problem is why it's so hard to do, as I said before, is that Pentagon doesn't really own the funding process. OMB and the Hill are so incredibly involved in such a strong way that it's really hard to make adjustments. The fear of retribution has pervaded for decades.
All right, final question. Looking to a world where there is no fear and no risk, you had a magic wand, what would you change about the business of national security in America?
Two things come to mind. I think we're getting better about employing private capital. I think we need to lean into that further. That's one. And then the second is I think we need to do a lot better we spend a lot of time on bringing in new capabilities, getting things started, like trying to start programs well, prototyping, R&D, that kind of stuff. I don't think we spend as much time focusing on scaling. And I think that our domestic manufacturing base needs to be greatly improved, especially if we're going to actually go to war. We're going to need a much stronger production capability. And I think we recognize it, but I don't think we're doing enough to try to galvanize our U.S. domestic manufacturing. And I don't just mean like have more manufacturers insourcing more. I mean, actually make sure that what is there is modernized and it's using advanced manufacturing and the processing systems are digital and as opposed to, the old-fashioned processes. And I think that we could stand to do quite a lot more in that regard.
Yeah, no, I wish we had more time to dig into more of those areas because I feel like that magic wand isn't that necessarily that far away. And so maybe that's part of the optimism that you shared here. But that is our time. So Dr. Alexis Lasselle Ross, an expert of policy, appropriations, acquisitions, the business of national security. Thank you so much for being on this podcast. If folks want to continue following your work and your next great speaking engagement, where should they go to see where you're going to be presenting next? Are you on the LinkedIns of the world?
I'm on LinkedIn. My company's website is apexdsdc.com, but I don't post too much stuff, I don't think. So
we'll post your website on this podcast. So if folks want to further engage and take advantage of some of those great consulting insights, we'll make sure that folks have a link to follow and click through so they can better learn from your years of experience. Alexis, thank you so very much for being on the podcast.
No, thanks, Ian. It was great. It was fun.